A manuscript sits in a climate-controlled vault in Frankfurt, copied by hand more than 500 years ago, itself a copy of a copy of a copy, stretching back to a language most people alive today have never heard spoken. Scholars walk past pages of it every year without stopping, because the book it belongs to was removed from official scripture 17 centuries ago. But 3 chapters buried inside it do something no other surviving text from the ancient world does. They describe in plain physical language a journey into the interior of the earth, 4 separate chambers carved into solid rock, a river of fire flowing in one specific direction, sealed storerooms nobody has opened, and a name, spoken by a spirit that has not stopped crying out in 4,000 years. Today we are going to walk through what that book actually says, cross-check it against a second independent copy buried in a cave for 2,000 years, and ask a question almost nobody has asked out loud. If you followed this text's directions literally, where on the map would you end up? If ancient texts and the things they were quietly erased for saying interest you, subscribe. We cover forgotten scripture and the history behind why it disappeared every week. The book is called First Enoch. It is not obscure fan fiction. Fragments of it were found at Qumran, the same caves that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, in 11 separate handwritten copies of the base text alone, plus another set of manuscripts from a closely related work called the Book of Giants. 11 copies. For comparison, most books of the traditional Hebrew Bible survive at Qumran in only 1 or 2 copies. Whoever kept these caves valued Enoch enough to keep recopying it, generation after generation, for centuries before anyone in Rome or Alexandria decided what would and would not count as scripture. The man the book is named after appears briefly in Genesis, described in one line as someone who walked with God and then was not, because God took him. Genesis gives him 1 sentence. First Enoch gives him more than 100 chapters, and inside those chapters is a section modern scholars simply call the Cosmic Journeys, a guided tour, angel by angel, through the physical structure of the world Enoch lived in. Not a dream, not a parable told in the third person, a first-person account, written the way you'd write a travel log, of being taken somewhere and shown specific things by name. The central question this raises is simple, and almost nobody sits with it long enough to answer. If this text is describing an actual place, using words like foundation, cornerstone, and hollow, rather than symbolic language, what happens if you treat that description the way you'd treat any other ancient geography, as a set of directions someone expected a reader to be able to follow? Because that is exactly how the text reads once you strip away centuries of assuming it must be metaphor. 3 angels appear across these chapters as guides, first unnamed figures, then Uriel, then Raphael, and each one narrates what Enoch is looking at with the flat, specific tone of someone pointing at real terrain, not the tone of someone describing a vision. Coming up, we're going to walk through exactly what those 3 guides showed him, chapter by chapter, starting with the descent itself, because chapter 17 does not ease into this. It drops Enoch straight into it. But before we go there, it's worth understanding how close this text came to disappearing from the world entirely. Outside Ethiopia, First Enoch was considered lost for well over 1,000 years. European scholars knew it existed only because early Christian writers quoted fragments of it, and for centuries those quotes were the only trace anyone in the West had. Then, in 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce returned from 6 years in the Ethiopian highlands carrying 3 complete Ge'ez copies of the text. The first, the Western world had seen in roughly 14 centuries. He deposited one in the Bodleian Library, another with the Royal Library in Paris, and a third he personally presented to the Pope. And here's the detail that doesn't usually make it into the summary. The reaction wasn't excitement. Prominent scholars of the period spent decades afterward arguing the manuscripts had to be a later forgery, precisely because the content was considered too specific, too internally consistent, to have survived from antiquity by accident. It wasn't until 1821 that Richard Lawrence at Oxford finally produced the first English translation, and it took the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries in 1947 to settle, once and for all, that the text Bruce carried out of Ethiopia was exactly what it claimed to be. Chapter 17 begins with almost no transition. Enoch is simply taken, the text says, "They took me," to a place where he sees beings that look like flaming fire when they choose to, and like men when they choose to. From there, he's brought to a mountain whose peak reaches into the sky, and then, immediately, to the places where the luminaries are kept, the treasuries of the stars, the storerooms of thunder, arrows and bows of fire held in the deepest reaches. Then the text does something worth sitting with. It says he was brought to the living waters, and to the fire of the west, the fire that receives the sun every time it sets. And then, one line later, the detail almost nobody quotes, a river of fire, flowing like water, discharging itself into the great sea toward the west. Not east, not down, west. In every cosmology of the ancient Near East, west is not a neutral direction. It is the direction of the setting sun, the direction of death, the direction of the edge of the known world, the same direction Egyptian funerary texts sent the dead, the same direction later Greek writers placed the underworld's entrance. Enoch's guide is not choosing that direction poetically. He's choosing it because that's where the geography the text describes actually sits. By the end of chapter 17, Enoch has crossed into territory the text explicitly separates from the world of the living, a place, it says, where no flesh walks. That's the first rehook, and it's a big one. Whatever comes next in chapter 18 is happening somewhere the text has just told you humans do not normally go. Chapter 18 is where the architecture gets specific enough to stop reading as poetry. Enoch says, in the plainest possible language, that he saw the storehouses of all the winds, sealed, structural, holding something back. Then, in the very next line, the foundations of the earth. Then, the cornerstone of the earth. Not a cornerstone. The cornerstone, the specific, singular, load-bearing point the rest of the structure rests on, described with the same word used elsewhere in that period's literature for an actual piece of construction. The stonemasons set first, and everything else gets measured against. Around that cornerstone, 4 winds are described holding the earth and the sky apart, functioning as pillars, not symbols of pillars. The text calls them the pillars of heaven directly. This is a text describing the underside of the world, the way an engineer describes a foundation, not the way a poet describes a feeling. Here's the detail almost every casual reading skips past. The storehouses aren't just described, they're described as sealed, contents held back, under pressure, waiting. The text doesn't explain what happens when they open. It just tells you they exist, exactly where they are relative to the cornerstone, and that they haven't been opened. If you're building a mental map of the interior of the earth as this text understands it, you now have 3 fixed points: a cornerstone at the center of the structure, sealed storehouses arranged around it, and a river of fire running west, out toward open sea. That's not vague spiritual imagery. That's a location with landmarks. The text doesn't stop at 3 landmarks either. A few lines later in the same chapter, Enoch turns south, and the description keeps going with the same specificity. 7 mountains, made of precious stone, 3 positioned to the east and 3 to the south, arranged in a formation the text treats as fixed and countable rather than symbolic. 7 mountains. Not many mountains, not great mountains. 7, with a stated compass orientation for each cluster. That's the kind of detail you'd expect from someone describing a place they were trying to help a reader locate. Not the kind of detail a writer reaches for when the point is simply to evoke grandeur. Whoever composed this text kept counting and kept orienting, chapter after chapter, as if the geography actually mattered to get right. Second rehook, right at the boundary of chapter 18 and 19. Enoch is shown a desolate, terrible place, a dark pit with heavenly fire, and told this is a prison. Not a metaphor for punishment, an actual described prison, holding beings the text says failed to arrive somewhere on time and are being held until a specific future date. A prison, inside the earth, with a release date. If you've been tracking this as a physical structure so far, this is the moment it starts to feel less like geology and more like something built and used on purpose. Chambers, seals, and now a holding cell, all in the same descending path. By the time chapter 19 closes, Enoch has been shown foundations, a cornerstone, sealed storehouses, and a prison, and he still hasn't reached the part of the journey the text spends the most words on. That comes 3 chapters later, when a second guide takes over, and the description stops being architectural and starts being occupied. Chapter 20 introduces something the earlier chapters didn't have, a named list of angels and their specific assignments, almost like a staff directory for the structure Enoch has been walking through. Uriel is named as the one over the world, and Tartarus, the deep place. Raphael is named as the one over the spirits of men. That single line matters more than it looks like it does, because it tells you the text is about to hand Enoch off to a specialist. Uriel showed him the architecture. Raphael is about to show him who lives there. That handoff happens in chapter 22, and it's the densest, most specific chapter in the entire sequence. This is the section modern readers who bother to look past the summary tend to find genuinely startling. Raphael brings Enoch to a great high mountain of hard rock, and inside that mountain are 4 hollow places. The text uses that word, hollow, repeatedly. Not vision, not realm, hollow. The same word you'd use for a cave or a carved-out chamber. 4 of them. Smooth, deep, and, the text says directly, dark to look at. Raphael doesn't leave Enoch to guess what they're for. He explains it immediately. These hollow places exist specifically so that the spirits of the dead can be gathered into them, made for that exact purpose, holding them until a day of judgment and an appointed time. Here's the mid-act complication. The text doesn't describe one undifferentiated holding pen. It describes 4 distinct chambers, and it makes clear they're not identical. Different populations, different conditions, different waiting states. That's a level of internal structure most ancient underworld descriptions simply don't bother with. Most traditions give you one shadowy afterlife and stop there. This text gives you a floor plan, and then it gets specific in a way that stops the whole thing from reading as generic myth. Enoch hears a voice, a spirit making its case, its complaint rising all the way to heaven. He asks Raphael whose voice it is, and Raphael answers with a name. This is the spirit that came out of Abel, murdered by his brother Cain, and he is pleading his case, and he will not stop pleading it until Cain's line is completely wiped from the face of the earth. Not a symbol representing grief in general. A specific individual, named directly, placed in a specific chamber, doing a specific thing, continuously, for 4,000 years by the text's own internal timeline. That is a level of narrative specificity that separates this from every comparable underworld description surviving from the ancient Near East. Most of them describe generic shades. This one gives you a plaintiff with an open case. It's also worth knowing that this isn't a detail that shifted or softened as the text passed through different hands. When Richard Lawrence produced his 1821 translation directly from the Ethiopic manuscripts Bruce had carried out of Africa, Abel's name and his unending complaint were there. When R.H. Charles produced his own more rigorous translation decades later, cross-checking against additional manuscripts that had surfaced in the meantime, the same detail held. And when the Aramaic fragments from Qumran finally became available for comparison in the 20th century, scholars weren't checking whether the story was there, they were checking whether centuries of hand copying across 2 languages and 2 continents had preserved it accurately. It had. A detail that's specific staying intact across translations, separated by more than 2,000 years and 2 completely different linguistic traditions, is not the kind of thing that happens to material nobody was being careful with. Third rehook of the act. If Abel is in one chamber, named, active, Still speaking, what's in the other three? The text tells you they're differentiated by condition, some for those awaiting reward, some for those awaiting punishment, one apparently sealed and separate from the rest. 4 chambers, 1 occupant named directly, 3 more implied, unnamed, and, depending on which manuscript tradition you're reading, one of them consistently described as different from the other 3 in a way translators have argued over for over a century. Now here's where the second guide's testimony becomes something you can actually check against outside evidence instead of just taking on faith. This isn't the only ancient document describing this territory. A separate, related text, the Book of Giants, survives in its own set of manuscripts from the same caves, copied by the same community, dealing with the same cosmology, the same angelic hierarchy, the same underlying geography of imprisonment and judgment beneath the world. It isn't a retelling of First Enoch. It's a companion text, written from a different angle, about the same structure. And the fact that it exists in 10 separate manuscript copies at Qumran alone tells you this wasn't a fringe idea one scribe invented once. This was a shared, actively maintained body of geography that an entire community treated as consistent and worth preserving in multiple independent copies over generations. That's the equivalent of finding a second document, written by different people, in a different place, that happens to describe the same mountain, the same direction, the same structure, without one obviously copying the other word for word. When 2 independent sources converge on the same physical description of something, that's usually the point where you stop calling it folklore and start calling it a tradition people believed was describing something real. And the storehouse motif from chapter 18 doesn't stop at chapter 18 either. Later sections of the same book, further along in Enoch's journeys, return to the language of sealed storehouses again, this time naming snow, hail, and dew specifically as substances kept in reserve, released only at appointed times. That's not a contradiction between chapters. It's an expansion, the same underlying architecture described twice, once briefly during the descent, and once in more detail once the framework has already been established. A writer inventing this on the fly, chapter by chapter, without an internal logic to keep straight, tends to drop details like that. A writer working from a consistent, remembered structure tends to circle back and add texture to what's already been placed on the map. That's the kind of internal consistency you'd expect from a description someone was actually trying to preserve accurately, not embellish freely. 4th rehook, and this is the one that reframes everything that's come before it. All of this, the cornerstone, the storehouses, the prison, the 4 hollow chambers, happens in a specific, consistent direction. West, then further west, then south and west again, out past the edge of the world people actually lived in and traveled through. The text isn't vague about this the way a dream account would be. It repeats the direction. It anchors the mountain of chapter 22 specifically in the west, the same direction as the river of fire in chapter 17, the same direction as the fire that swallows the setting sun. Every landmark this text gives you points the same way. So by the time chapter 22 ends, here's what you actually have on the table, stripped of interpretation. A foundational cornerstone at the center of a described earth structure, sealed storehouses around it, a prison holding specific beings until an appointed date, a great high mountain made of hard rock located consistently to the west, containing 4 internally differentiated hollow chambers, one occupant of which is named directly and is described as still active inside it, and a second independently preserved text from the same community corroborating the broader cosmology without simply repeating it. That's not a spiritual metaphor scattered across 3 chapters. That's a location description with recurring landmarks, cross-referenced by a second document. And it raises the obvious next question, the one almost no mainstream commentary sits with for more than a sentence. If you took this seriously as geography, instead of automatically filing it as allegory the moment it got uncomfortable, what happened to it? Why did a text this specific, this internally consistent, this independently corroborated, end up removed from Scripture entirely across most of the world, while one single church, in one specific country, kept it, copied it, and never stopped treating it as real? The removal wasn't gradual, and it wasn't accidental. There's a date, the Council of Laodicea, held around 363 to 364 of the Common Era, is one of the key moments where church authorities formally drew the line on what would count as Scripture going forward, and First Enoch fell on the wrong side of that line. This wasn't an obscure regional decision that got quietly overturned later. It stuck. Major figures who shaped what most of the world would eventually read as the Bible, Athanasius, Origen, and later Jerome himself, the man who translated the text that would become the standard Latin Bible for over 1,000 years, all treated First Enoch as apocryphal, not lost, not forgotten, actively excluded. This pattern of resistance didn't start in the 4th century, and it didn't end there either. Even after James Bruce brought physical copies back to Europe in the 1770s, some of the era's most respected scholars refused to accept them as genuine. Hiob Ludolf, the leading Ethiopic scholar of his generation, argued the entire text was a recent forgery, invented long after the fact and falsely attributed to antiquity. For nearly 2 centuries, that skepticism was the dominant academic position in the West, even as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church continued reading the same text as Scripture, uninterrupted, the entire time. It took the Dead Sea Scrolls, physically dated fragments sitting in the ground since before the time of Jesus, to finally force Western scholarship to admit the skeptics had been wrong for the better part of 200 years. And that's what makes the next part so strange. This wasn't a text nobody respected before the exclusion. Earlier church writers, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, had quoted it, referenced it, in some cases treated it as inspired scripture in its own right. So somewhere in the space of a couple of centuries, a text respected enough to be quoted by major early Christian writers went from live scripture to formally apocryphal, right around the same window when the chapters describing the interior of the earth in this level of physical detail would have been sitting in front of the same councils making that call. Here's the rehook that changes how you read everything that follows. Jerome didn't just leave it out by oversight. He was the single most important translator in the history of the Latin Church, personally responsible for the version of the Bible that would dominate the Western world for over a millennium. And when he built that translation, First Enoch did not go in. Once a book isn't in the dominant translation people are actually reading and copying, it doesn't need to be banned. It just stops getting copied. It fades out through simple neglect, generation by generation, until most of the Christian world doesn't know it exists. Except it didn't fade out everywhere. One church kept it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never dropped it. Their biblical canon runs to 81 books total, 46 in the Old Testament and 35 in the New, and Enoch sits directly among them, canonical, unremoved, still read as scripture to this day. And the reason isn't some act of quiet rebellion against Rome. It's geography. Ethiopia's position, surrounded by mountains, bordered by the Red Sea, later cut off from the rest of Christendom by the expansion of Islam across North Africa, meant it was never inside the reach of the councils making these decisions. Ethiopia wasn't reading Jerome's Vulgate. Ethiopia wasn't represented when later councils finalized what would and wouldn't count. The canon that reached them in the earliest centuries simply stayed intact, because no external authority ever came far enough to narrow it. Which means for close to 2,000 years, there has been exactly one place on Earth where the most physically specific description of the Earth's interior surviving from antiquity was never treated as myth, never treated as apocryphal, never edited out, while everywhere else, the same text was actively excluded by the same men who decided what the rest of the world would read as scripture. And then, in 1947, The rest of the world got a second copy anyway. Not from Ethiopia, from a cave. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran, contained Aramaic fragments of First Enoch, 11 separate manuscript copies of the base text, proving the material wasn't a late Ethiopian invention at all, but something copied and recopied in the Judean desert, centuries before Jerome ever picked up a pen. The community that hid those scrolls in caves ahead of the Roman destruction of the region valued this text enough to preserve multiple copies of it, alongside the related Book of Giants material, in the same caves that gave the modern world its oldest surviving fragments of the Hebrew Bible itself. So the text the Western canon spent 17 centuries treating as excluded had already been independently, physically verified, sitting in a jar in a cave, as genuinely ancient, genuinely widely copied, and genuinely taken seriously by the community that hid it. It just took until the middle of the 20th century for the rest of the world to be forced to reckon with that fact. Here's what that leaves us with. A text describing the interior of the earth with landmarks specific enough to function as directions, a cornerstone, sealed storehouses, a prison, and a great mountain to the west containing 4 internally distinct chambers, one occupant of which is named and described as still active inside it after 4,000 years. A second, independently preserved companion text corroborating the same underlying cosmology from Qumran caves, a documented, dated removal from Western scripture by the same authorities who shaped the Bible most of the world reads today, and one surviving tradition, isolated by geography rather than by choice, that never stopped treating any of it as real. None of that proves there's a literal mountain somewhere on this planet with 4 physical chambers carved into it. That's an important line to hold, because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the fantasy version. What it proves is something almost as strange, that an ancient community treated a physically specific description of the Earth's interior as important enough to copy, recopy, and preserve across at least 2 independent manuscript traditions, in 2 different languages, for well over 2,000 years, while the institutions that decided what counted as official scripture actively worked to remove it from circulation entirely. That's not a story about buried civilizations. That's a story about information suppression that actually happened, on a documented timeline, to a text specific enough that later readers keep coming back to it, wanting to know exactly what it was describing. Whether you read the cornerstone and the hollow mountain as literal geology, as ancient cosmological language for something else entirely, or as a genuinely lost description of a place nobody's gone looking for using this text as a map, the fact that it was deliberately edited out, while one isolated church kept it intact for 2,000 years, is not speculation. That part is simply what happened. And that's the detail almost nobody sits with. Every other ancient underworld description, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, reads as broad, symbolic, built for meaning rather than measurement. This is the one that gives you a cornerstone, storehouses, a named prisoner, making an active legal case against his own murderer, 4,000 years running, a consistent direction, and a second independent document from the same era, backing the same basic structure. If any other ancient culture had left behind a physical description this specific, this internally consistent, and this corroborated by a second surviving source, historians would already be treating it as a serious geographic claim worth investigating, not filing it under mythology and moving on. Nobody has ever mounted an expedition using First Enoch's directions the way people have chased Bronze Age tablets to specific valleys and specific cave systems. Nobody has taken the westward river of fire, the cornerstone, and the great hollow mountain and treated them as coordinates instead of poetry. The text has been sitting in plain sight, in 11 independent Qumran copies and an unbroken Ethiopian tradition, for 2,000 years, still saying exactly the same thing it always said. Compare that to how seriously scholars treat physical geography and other ancient religious and historical texts. When a Mesopotamian tablet names a mountain range and a trade route, researchers spend decades trying to place it on a modern map. When an Egyptian text names a specific temple location, expeditions get funded to go find it. But a text this specific about the interior of the world itself, preserved in two independent traditions, in two different languages, across 2,000 years, has mostly been read by people already convinced in advance that it has to be metaphor, because the alternative is uncomfortable. That assumption is doing a lot of work nobody ever bothers to justify out loud. So where does that leave the actual question? Is there something physically inside the earth matching what Enoch describes? Almost certainly, the honest answer is no, not as a literal hollow cavity waiting to be entered. What the text most likely preserves is something else, and it might be more valuable than a literal cave system, an ancient community's attempt to describe the structure of the world using the only vocabulary available to them: foundation, cornerstone, storehouse, prison, borrowed directly from the language of construction and civic order, applied to cosmic geography they had no other way to express. That doesn't make it less real as a historical artifact. It makes it a genuinely rare window into how one specific community, roughly 2,000 years ago, tried to map the unknown using the tools of the known. But that reading doesn't erase the stranger part of this story, and it's worth sitting with before you close the tab. This text was specific enough, consistent enough, and independently corroborated enough that the people in charge of building the Western Bible chose to remove it rather than leave it in. And the only reason any of us can check their work today is that a separate, isolated community kept 11 copies safe in the desert, and a separate, isolated church kept it in continuous use on a different continent entirely. Two independent chains of preservation, working without contact with each other, both deciding this text mattered enough to keep. The manuscript in that vault in Frankfurt and the fragments sitting in climate-controlled cases from Qumran are still saying exactly what they said when they were first copied. A cornerstone, storehouses, sealed, a mountain to the west, 4 chambers, and one voice that has not stopped since Genesis put down that first sentence about 2 brothers and a field. Nobody removed the text because it was boring. They removed it because of exactly how specific it was, and specificity is usually the first thing you cut when you don't want people checking your work. If you want to go looking at primary sources yourself, the Ethiopic text and the Qumran fragments are both publicly available, and reading them side by side is a different experience than reading anyone's summary of them, including this one. If forgotten scripture and the real history behind what got left out is something you want more of, hit subscribe. We're going deeper into these texts every week.